the Fisher family and the Kornstein family, my mother and father's family. The Kornsteins were the last of the three families, last of the Brenner, Fisher, and Kornstein to arrive. And the Kornsteins came, there was a very large Hungarian population in Elgin, and he was supposed to come to set up business, to set up a tailor shop, and he immigrated here and connected with the large Hungarian population that was here, and he went to work in the foundry. And then my grandmother came in 1914. My mother was 2 years old and my uncle was 9 months. And she arrived and pulled my grandfather out of the foundry, and they bought a building at 121 Douglas Avenue, and he set up his tailor shop in the front. They lived in the back until they were had enough funding to buy their home, their first of many homes. The Fisher family arrived in Elgin much earlier. They arrived from Lithuania. My grandfather, Fisher, had to serve all of his brother's terms of military duty in the Tsar's army because his brothers had fled to the United States, and so he was left to carry the ball for the rest of the family. So he served their terms, and then he fled and came here, settled in Chicago near Maxwell Street with his bride, Mary Bluestone Fisher, and then they came to Elgin for greater economic opportunity.
Our grandparents came from Europe. In the case of Harold, my father, his parents came from Lithuania in 1897 or 1898 to Elgin. They originally emigrated shortly before that to Chicago at the turn of the prior century. And there were several brothers, approximately 8 or 9 and one sister. And they had a Lithuanian name, it was Chaimovitz. And they first came to Chicago. All of the brothers, except for Gershon, who later became named Harry, my name, he came to Elgin again in 1898, I believe. On my mother's side, she herself was born in Germany, and she is now 86 years old. She emigrated as a result of Nazism in Germany that arose in the very early 30s in Germany. She immigrated to Elgin, actually to the south side of Chicago, directly from Mainz, Germany in 1937. And she obviously, like so many German Jews, were forced to leave the country. But in many ways, while she's not a Holocaust survivor, she was a refugee and fortunately got out before the beginning of the Holocaust 2 years later.
Hayakawa, S.I. Hayakawa, wrote a book years and years ago, late 40s, and he was at San Francisco and was a philosopher and so forth. And he wrote a book called Language and Thought in Action. And he described the Jewish people in the United States as being marginal businessmen. They basically didn't have the keys to running railroads and being involved in steel and so forth, and that they were marginal businessmen with mama and papa shops in the communities. Historically, Jews were not farmers because they weren't allowed to own land. And historically, they didn't work with their hands because they were not allowed to join guilds in Europe. So there you were in Poland or Lithuania or Russia or Germany or wherever, and you were limited on what you could do. So they went into retail. They not only went into retail, they went into money lending and so forth. So you have a lot of people named Goldberg, Goldstein, Silverman. They were marginal businessmen. They were not allowed to join the unions and the guilds. They were not allowed to own land. So there wasn't really a lot of choice. A lot of that carried over to the New World, to the United States.
Up and down Douglas Avenue, there was one store or another owned by Jewish merchants. And my father was very proud of the fact and wanted to impart to us of how hardworking all of these people were. They came literally with nothing, and I mean nothing, and they made something of themselves and certainly passed on a a fantastic heritage to their children.
There was only an Orthodox synagogue here, the little place on Villa Street, and it was really Orthodox, where the men and women were separated by the curtain. And my mother had been raised in a Reformed family. So she took me to Chicago every Sunday for 4 years to go to Sunday school so I could be confirmed. And then when they became conservative, then we joined the synagogue. And they've had a synagogue for over 100 years, and everybody goes to the one, and everybody mixes. I mean, okay, you're the middle of the road, you're this way, but there's only one, so everybody has to get along with it, with everybody else, you know.
In October of this year, we hit our 113th anniversary of existence as a congregation here in Elgin. We encompass membership from about 20 different communities surrounding Elgin. Today, we have become, over years, a little more modern and more conservative. The most observant would be the Orthodox. At the other end of the picture is the Reform, which interestingly enough is moving towards a little more conservative today, but they will never change. And then, of course, right smack dab in the middle is conservative. And then, of course, there's Reconstructionists, and I still haven't been able to determine in my mind what the difference is between, you know, the two of them.
The Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, instructs the early Jews during their period in the wilderness that on their fields they always should set aside a plot for the poor. And that tradition of giving back, of, in Hebrew, tzedakah, of charity, of looking after the less fortunate, is something that is part of Jewish tradition. The Seigle Family Foundation grew out of an experience Harold had when he was visiting with the school nurse at the old Elgin High School on DuPage Street. And she explained to Harold that most of her problems with kids weren't profound illnesses, but rather kids who were catching cold because they didn't have galoshes or appropriate shoes to wear in the winter, didn't have an overcoat to wear as the fall turned into the winter. That astonished my father. And he said, well, if you needed to solve that problem, how would you solve it? And she said, oh, if I could only have a charge account where I could send these kids downtown to Penny's or to Sears, and they could buy an overcoat and galoshes and appropriate gear for the winter. And that was the beginning of the foundation. Elgin was, in my view, exemplary in its acceptance of Jewish people, Greek people, black people. In the schools, Elgin teachers always wanted the Jewish students to have a chance to share what Hanukkah was about and how it was distinguished from Christmas. There was always an opportunity during the holy days, high holy days, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, to explain to the class what those in those days funny words meant and why we couldn't go to school on those days. It was also a tension in the families. I remember vividly my sister Marcia was a cheerleader for Elgin High School, not an insignificant accomplishment back in those days, and probably today too. And of course, homecoming came on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, and the tears that were shed that she couldn't cheer her team on because she had to go to synagogue, not high on her list of adolescent priorities, I can guarantee you.
I just reflect on going through Elgin High School, graduating in 1954. It was just a magical time. I just had the best years growing up.
Growing up in Elgin, you were everybody's child. You were a child in your own family, but whenever anything happened, everybody, it was just, there was a lot of togetherness. It was a wonderful place to grow up.